So is it an election-winning budget? We cross now to our Wellington studio and economist Bernard Hickey, who's been all over today's events. Evening, Bernard. In a few words, how do you describe this budget?
Well, this really is a tweak and fiddle budget by a government that's determined to get re-elected. It should really be addressing the structural deficit that the New Zealand government faces and not relying on a forecast for growth to get it out of its debt problems. And it's a sign that we're close to an election, but it's also a sign that the government doesn't really want to address the problems that we have and avoid more pain in another year or two to come.
OK, so an election-winning budget, but do you buy the notion at all that there'll be a return to surplus by 2014, as the government's saying?
Well, the government's forecasting growth over the next couple of years of between 2 and 4%. And what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years since the global financial crisis is that that growth that's been forecast hasn't arrived. In fact, the Treasury's been wrong for 3 of the last 3 years. They've forecast growth of between 2–3%. Instead, we've had no growth at all. And that's because something has changed in the economy. New Zealand households and businesses are much more reluctant to spend. They instead want to save and repay debt. And that means any recovery from the recession is going to be slower and lower than it was before the global financial crisis. And the Treasury hasn't taken that into account. So there is a big risk that in the next couple of years, perhaps we have some sort of financial crisis in Europe or China slows down, we end up back in the same position, having to go back to voters and to taxpayers and saying, well, it's much worse than we expected. We're going to have another round of cuts.
So this is a disingenuous budget then?
Oh, I think the government genuinely believes the forecast they're getting from Treasury, and that's all they've got to work with. The trouble is, of course, that Treasury, and to be fair, lots of other economists, have been wrong over the last 2 to 3 years. I think the government should be a lot more cautious. And in fact, when you look deep inside the budget, you can find that the Inland Revenue Department are actually a lot more sanguine about the likely impact of growth on revenues. The Inland Revenue are actually saying revenues over the next few years will be $4 billion lower than what Treasury have forecast, yet the government's chosen to use those more rosy forecasts from Treasury. So I think the government, if it was being genuinely conservative, would have decided to put more weight on some of those more conservative forecasts.
OK, well, let's look at what you think would have been the right answer in just a moment. But we'll break down first what the government has put forward. KiwiSaver. The government's going to halve its contribution to its annual contribution to KiwiSaver. What's going to be the long-term impact of these proposed changes? And I guess given among the predictions that the enrolment rates will fall?
Well, the enrolment rates are already much higher than the government was forecasting. They were expecting around 600,000 or 700,000 by now to have signed up. Instead, there's been 1.7 million. So, to be fair to the government, it's likely most people will stay inside KiwiSaver. There are still some benefits of being in there. The question is, will more people join up, and will they voluntarily increase their enrolments?
What's your expectation?
I think we'll see the growth in KiwiSaver enrolments tail off from now. The amount of publicity we've seen in the last month or so suggesting that the benefits from the government are not so high will cause people to think again. Also, we're about to go into year 4 of essentially a recession. And when people are that stressed, when prices are rising as they have, people are unlikely to be in a willing position to jump in and save more. There is, interestingly, though, a suggestion from the government that they might have some sort of one-off automatic enrolment, which could boost those numbers again. OK, government department cuts. The government's saying you've got to cut your budgets, but they're not going to prescribe exactly how. Is that wise or not? It's quite strange, really, because usually public servants are reluctant to make decisions about how to spend money or to save money. They usually have governments and ministers to tell them what to do. And that will be an interesting challenge. Who takes responsibility for these cuts? Eventually, it should be the government, not the public servants. And I suspect the government will have to get in there, boots and all, roll out their sleeves and force those cuts through after the election. This is the thing. When you look at those budget numbers, a lot of the pain isn't forecast to happen until late in 2011, early 2012, after the election.
Yeah, that is a very interesting move there. Let's talk about working for families. Low-income earners will get some small increases, but the costs of this scheme have doubled over the last 4 years, so cuts had to be made, or perhaps worse in your view?
I think working for families should have been abandoned completely, as should have interest-free student loans. They are huge chunks of middle-class welfare this government and this nation can't afford. We were kidding ourselves over the last decade that we were worth more than we were. We were essentially living beyond our means and borrowing to do it. We need to face up to that fact, and one way to do it is to remove working for families and interest-free student loans. And I suspect when we have the inevitable growth slowdown and the moment when the government says after the election we can't afford this, that it will go as well.
Along with introducing a land tax, you propose?
Yes, that's right. There's certainly ways for the government to reduce that deficit. Reducing spending is one way, but also increasing revenues. And New Zealand has a group of people who've done very well out of the boom in land prices over the last decade. Those people need to share some of it, frankly, and give some of it back in the form of a land tax.
That's never going to go down well, though, is it, Bernard?
Well, with a small group of voters, and obviously a very influential lobby in the farming sector. But let's face it, unless we stop borrowing, we are going to end up along the likes of Greece, Portugal and Ireland, where we're forced to make these cuts by the IMF rather than choosing to make it ourselves.
So we're heading for the pig's trough?
Well, if we continue as we are, running a big structural deficit, if we continue to borrow, and if we continue to sell our juiciest assets and have to pay more and more every year in interest payments and dividends to foreign owners of assets here, we will go further down that trough. This is where we need to actually stand up and take back New Zealand's sovereignty, if you like, make sure we stop selling assets and borrowing more money.
So, Bernard, we do have to wrap in just a moment, sadly, but is there anything good in this budget?
Frankly, no. This was an opportunity for the government to condition New Zealand for a significant reduction in government spending and increase in taxes to try and solve our problems. And what unfortunately I think will happen is that most New Zealanders know that we're living beyond our means and that our government's doing it. And so New Zealanders will actually save for the government, on behalf of the government. So there may actually be a double whammy here for the government. By not choosing to take the tough action, households will do it for them, and the government and the economy slows even more.
OK, thanks for that, Bernard. We will leave it there. That's Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz.